Our next speaker is Tina Søreide. She's a research fellow in law and economics at the University of Bergen. And she has worked for the World Bank in Washington on its governance and anti-corruption agenda. And she is educated at this place with a PhD in economics. We are now looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
So far, we have got a fairly good sense of the financial secrecy map. This map from Tax Justice Network is probably familiar to many of you. It combines a measure of laws and regulations with they are the green bubbles, with a measure of the jurisdiction size and importance in the world economy. And as you can see, there are many green bubbles in the OECD area. And during this conference, we have got that confirmed that there are many problems with secrecy within the OECD jurisdictions. It's not only an issue in small islands. Within the OECD area, we don't only have bad legislation, as Tim Daniels, among others, pointed out, that we are not even enforcing the financial transparency laws that we do have. We have heard that the impacts are most serious for developing countries, but as Frian Orsnes pointed out on Tuesday, OECD countries are really starting to feel the leakage. We also heard that secrecy is not only about tax avoidance and evasion, it facilitates other forms of crime as well, as pointed out by Guttorm Schjelderup on Tuesday. And George Papandreou underscores that it threatens democracy and the function of important state institutions. So, what is it that we can add about resistance in the South? You have seen Tim Daniels already mentioned some of these dictators, and perhaps you can recognize them. But there must be more to this. For instance, there is a reason why they came to power in the first place. And one of those reasons is that they were not alone. They were brought to the top by a network of allies who get richer because they benefit from being allies. So we are not only dealing with a dictator and isolated cases, we are dealing with networks. And it can be really difficult to tell who's part of this network and who are eager to be part of it. And thus we don't really know who we can trust. And for members of these networks, we know that there will be resistance against initiatives that make grabbing difficult, initiatives that make it more difficult to hide stolen money, financial transparency in general. And we know very clearly that capital flight, money laundering, hidden funds, it is all somewhat associated with political corruption. However, when it comes to these networks and these powerful people, it can be difficult to prove that what they do is illegal, because what we know is that they can change the laws so that their acts are illegitimate yet legal. So we have to address not only illegal transactions, but illegitimate governments. And this is a definition from Farouk Al-Qasim, a person from Iraq who helped Norwegians develop the oil regulation institutions. He says that the political corruption can be defined as the manipulation of legal and institutional framework conditions to attain exclusive benefits to individuals or groups at the cost of social benefits. And these are the names of these, in case you wondered. So, If resistance against financial transparency has something to do with corruption, we have to combine different maps to get a full picture of the problem. This corruption perceptions index, as you are well aware of, all of you, is not very well able to capture political corruption, but it gives us a sense of the cross-country variation. As Eva Joly would have pointed out, if she was here, because she says it every time she gets an opportunity, is that the fight against financial secrecy implies a fight against corruption. So, but if we get when we compare these two maps from Tax Justice Network and Transparency International, we see that they are very different. The problems appear to be very different. Red is more serious on both maps. Green bubbles are the most interesting in this context. But when we look at these two maps, you can easily get the impression that the corruption problems in the south benefit tax havens in the north. So even if political corruption has been mentioned several times during these days, I think it can be useful to consider how we deal with this a bit more systematically. Why is it so difficult to get rid of it when whole populations want to get rid of it? And this is a question I have studied in different ways, in statistically, theoretical analysis of incentive problems, market analysis, political economy analysis. I've been traveling. I've done more than 200 face-to-face interviews in developing countries, all on corruption. And that's a lot if you know what Lagos traffic jam looks like. So I will discuss 4 categories of reasons: democracy, law enforcement, international anti-corruption initiatives, and incentive problems among governments. So, democracy is a good thing. It correlates strongly with high GDP levels and happiness. But we all know that democratic reform in a developing country is not a guarantor of success. The accountability we hope to see is associated with the propensity of politicians and decision makers to act in accordance with the expressed preferences of the population and in respect of legal rules and institutions. And such accountability requires some form of dialogue between the decision makers and the people. Citizens' opinions should be shaped in active communication among different players in society, particularly the press, civil society, political parties. If these activities are not encouraged or actively discouraged, we don't really have a democracy, even if elections are being held. And other governments should be careful to consider the government legitimate. However, even when it works, even when we have this kind of dialogue, voters cannot really be trusted to remove bad politicians by punish them in the next election, of course. Voters judge politicians on a whole range of issues other than raw performance. Some voters will vote for a certain political party, whoever the candidate is. Some will vote for charismatic leaders, female leaders to improve the gender balance in politics, specific results that matter to them, promises of a reform that will never happen. They can be myopic and simply forgotten about the failures of the incumbent, or they will vote for a new candidate who does the same mistakes as the former. So democracy, well, the politicians have to be really bad for voters to certainly remove them, and in those situations it's sometimes too late because they manage to bolster their power in these networks of allies. So democracy may prevent these kind of problems, but it's not very efficient in terms of fixing political corruption. Consider Angola, for example. I have done studies on political corruption and how it distorts the construction sector in Angola. And our research partners, they call it the democracy. I have been there. I've been several times and collaborated closely with citizens. I've seen the poverty. And nevertheless, I have been a bit surprised to see it at the bottom of all rankings. I wanted to look carefully about what does all these indices tell us about Angola, and it is at the bottom on human rights, life expectancy, income differences, press freedom, corruption, governance effectiveness, and I was surprised about governance effectiveness because they have an oil industry, so I was thinking it should be some technology transfers at least. And it on income difference and regulatory quality, cost of doing business is extremely high, and capital flight. But the bad index results is not really a problem for the decision makers because countries like Norway they do business with them. Now, I have to say also that the oil workers the Angolan oil workers, they love to work for the Norwegian oil company Statoil. They get labor unions and security. However, for Norway as a country, I think this is one of the we are a small oil-producing, peace-promoting country, and this is one of our most challenging international, biggest challenges internationally. So if democracy doesn't deliver, what about better laws, better regulation, better administration? Wouldn't that indirectly lead to better politics? As Guttorm pointed out on Tuesday, good institutions are essential for development. Of course, that is true only as far as they work. A new law is not enough. And I have seen many places how difficult legal reform can be. I visited Albania in 2002 and to teach public procurement. And they had EU laws passed, but they didn't translate them. Nobody could read the law. I met the new independent regulating institutions in the Philippines. They had excellent new laws reflecting international best practice. But when the regulators acted independently, they got a wage cut. In Malawi, I was task managing for the World Bank a project on construction transparency. And we really tried to convince the government to increase transparency in construction contracts. But if you had minister meetings, and they told us that we have to protect the commercial secrets for the private sector. But when we asked the private sector, they were fine about transparency. I studied per diem regulations in Tanzania and some other countries last year. And what we saw, legal reform means training. And it became so evident that many civil servants came for the per diem. Of course, not all of them, but many of them, they come for the per diem and not really for the training. In Nigeria, I was collaborating with Alex Geboyega, a researcher, and he did a study of audit officers. And when he visited all the states, he wanted to visit the audit officers. And even he was surprised to see that many of the audit officers was only a mailbox. It was a hut. It was nothing there. And this photo is taken, it was a construction site near a hotel I stayed at in Addis last year. And you can see that the scaffolding is made out of wood. And construction workers, we had this kind of construction sites all over the city. And people fell down, the construction workers fell down, and they died, and they were replaced. And it was much cheaper to replace them than to improve security. And that sad fact continues regardless of legislation. Of course, I'm underscoring something here, and it's not all like this in all situations, but at least better laws will not always deliver. So if we think of this a bit more systematically, we can think of what counts, under what circumstances will a new law bring change. And if we can think that we can place countries along two axes, one where we put the qualities of laws and regulations, and the other we put the strength of law enforcement. Up in this corner we will have the strong performance, those who have good laws, good enforcement. Their participation in international initiatives are important to get the initiatives up and going, but they don't really need it because they are always there. Many legal reforms are introduced as if countries are here, as if they are eager for new reforms. They just don't have the rules. In reality, they are here. They have laws. And this is something I've looked at in many different sectors. If we look at the procurement laws, the sector regulation laws, they are often quite good because they have been copied from other countries. A legal reform will not just make a change because the laws that were there at the first place, they were not respected. And sadly, for this category of countries, that's where we have the biggest challenges. We don't really have any good solutions. And then, okay, so of course laws do work in some situations. I'm just trying to put it, make an argument. Now, if we consider the international anti-corruption initiatives, how well are they able to help us get rid of political corruption? So one of the things that are actually quite influential are the governance indicators. Many think of that as just an indicator, corruption perception indicator, but they have been very important in raising awareness. They force a kind of comparison with other countries. Politicians, the press in many countries, they write about it, and the governments are forced to explain why they don't do better this year. But unfortunately, there's not an element of sanctions for the politicians and the decision makers in these indices. And then we have the UN Convention and other international laws as well. It has many rules that it improves international collaboration on anti-corruption. It has rules to exchange of information. It makes it possible to reverse the burden of proof. It has rules for asset recovery. Unfortunately, it's not much applied. And Edgardo Buscaglia, a researcher at Columbia University, did a study of its impact. And his main conclusion is that it depends on political will. There we go. And then there has been a lot of efforts to make ethical codes of conduct work. The UN Global Compact is one initiative among many. And of course, it may have an impact on the companies, but it doesn't really influence contract allocation. If contract allocation is determined by corruption, your ethical codes of conduct will not necessarily help you. And it will not necessarily change because the contract will be allocated. When it comes to the legal initiatives against cross-border bribery, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US and the OECD Anti-Bribery and the Security and Exchange Commission, these are initiatives that companies fear a lot. They really have an impact on company behavior now, many at least. The problem is that they don't reach they don't reach the politicians. We know the World Bank has this debarment list. They debar companies from getting contracts on World Bank financed. They cannot get World Bank finance contracts in any country if they are found guilty in, among other things, collusion and corruption. And in those cases, the World Bank sends the evidence to the governments, to a developing country, very often the developing country government, but it never reacts. There's not a response. They don't bring the cases to court in the countries. I happened to be in the Philippines once when a really big infrastructure scandal came into the media. It had been investigated over several years, and it became known when I was there. And political corruption was revealed. It was a case that had been investigated by World Bank investigators. And I was curious to see what would. I was assuming that the government would react and start to their own investigation. However, in the media and the reactions from the president I was surprised. He said, "We can always find a new development bank." That was the reaction. Sector. We already mentioned EITI, but there are many sector transparency initiatives now. And these are, of course, all like the other initiatives. They are important steps in the right direction. However, all of them are they go only as far as the political elite allows, because the design is shaped a little differently from country to country, and they don't really threaten. They give us more information, but they don't really threaten those who have positions. They don't lead to court cases. Besides, they are run by multi-stakeholder groups, and where all the players are involved in running the initiative. And in those groups, there are a lot of veto powers, and it's difficult to make them work efficiently. So, if none of these initiatives really address and combat political corruption, we cannot really expect that some of them will make them work. So what about other governments? On Tuesday, one lady from Tanzania, was maybe you, said that who can citizens of a poor country rely on when their politicians are corrupt and steal from the state revenues? When all these other initiatives don't work, who can we rely on? Other governments offer development aid and promote very, very important initiatives, but it is difficult to fight political corruption by offering money. The private sector, they have corporate social responsibility initiatives, but the contracts in countries where corruption is a big problem are more profitable. The reason is, of course, that the contracts are not allocated because of the best price-quality combinations. They are all allocated on some other criteria, which is a bribe, and then the companies can get better terms as well. In countries where corruption is a big problem, it is also much easier for companies to collude. The control on competition is weak. There's a very strong. So there is a very strong. It's a great opportunity for companies to profit more when there is corruption, and that is often forgotten when we talk. It's not should I go into Nigeria or should I go into Sweden. It's not these are not equal alternatives. Nigeria can be more profitable. And for governments, they want to keep a good dialogue with governments. Among other, they want to use that as an opportunity to help people and reduce poverty, obviously. But they also want access to resources, or they don't want other countries to get access to the resources. They want their firms to get contracts abroad, or they want to keep military collaboration with the incumbent government, or they want to protect the military collaboration with the French military alliances. So there are so many different objectives. There are so governments cannot be relied on when it comes to removing political corruption either. And the fact that we are lenient on tax havens is probably the main reason why these many anti-corruption initiatives have not delivered as much as we have hoped for. So when we started the fight against corruption in the mid-90s, early 2000, it was really about 15, 20 years ago, we didn't think this would be such a big problem when we got this far. We thought we would see more results. And one reason we have not seen more results is the secrecy, financial secrecy. So, like Olav Lundteigen said on Tuesday, many things are really moving in the right direction. And I have skipped a lot of nuances about what works well. But it is a fact, and it has been mentioned several times, that we don't have good enough solutions. We don't really know how to deal with political corruption internationally. We have to start think differently about many of these issues. And for example, the political economy issues. When I was at the World Bank, we were talking about political economy issues or incentive problems in governments, or we didn't really call it corruption because that is a legal term. So my impression is that the development community is very careful about calling political corruption, political incentive problems corruption, and they don't really think of this as crime, and it is crime. Political corruption is a crime, and what we have learned from the literature on crime is that sanctions work. The risk of being apprehended it works, we have to think differently about our commercial collaboration. It's not fine if it harms people elsewhere. Here in Norway, when somebody is are caught in a corruption case elsewhere, they again and again they say, but that's part of the business culture in that country. They say that it was legal before, but it was legal when we did it. And what they mean when they say that is that we were not prosecuted in Norway for the crimes we did in another country. And then they said this was legal. And this is something we hear again and again, as if bank robbery in Portugal would be okay if I'm not prosecuted in Norway. It's a kind of something about the way we think. And of course, when you meet a business agent in a developing country and he says, this is how we do things in this country, it's part of the culture. Well, he's part of this network. Of course he says it's part of the culture, but it undermines what the country tries to achieve. And corruption has been illegal in all countries. Business corruption has been illegal in all countries as long as they've had bureaucracy. There are some cases where some forms of corruption is not that as illegal as other places, but generally it has been illegal all over the world for a very long time. We have to also think differently when it comes to development collaboration, because one of the things we see is that many of the problems are up north, but the OECD says development agencies cannot spend money on their own institutions. So if we want to support developing countries, we cannot spend the money on institutions that could promote financial transparency in our own countries, even if that would be important to assist. So I think that is some of the. We have to think differently about how we can use development aid to reduce financial secrecy. So more specifically, how to deal with it. When it comes to identifying the resistance, we need to understand who are against. We need to identify the institutions and ministries. We need to know the wealth of the advisors, what job offers they have. Those who make an argument for financial secrecy, they have a reason to do it, as Fria Nåsnes pointed out earlier. We have to act when possible, and that's not an obvious thing to say, because as we have seen, the laws that we do have are not really enforced. We need to request information from firms, banks and governments in much greater extent than we do now. I think it was very fascinating to see this new Magnitsky law, where a lawyer in Russia had was killed, and he happened to work for a rich investor who has been traveling around to various countries to demand a law that restricts the travel opportunities and spending opportunities for the people who were involved in this case. And in many countries they are now passing this Magnitsky law as a reaction to that specific case. And that is an example of acting when possible because they have the evidence. Another thing is bargaining power means responsibility. Alison Christians said yesterday that we need to have a more nuanced view on sovereignty. And I think we need to put a heavy conditionality on integrity mechanisms when it is possible. So we have to think of when is it possible? Who are in position to demand integrity? This is a question of bargaining power, and some people have technology. Some big companies have technology. Some institutions offer aid. Some institutions offer loans. And as far as I can see, their bargaining position means responsibility. So those who are in position to demand integrity should do it. That's something we should expect. But that's also one of the things that I think we have to think differently about. I want to say that we should not avoid the politics. And this is, of course, based on experience from the World Bank, where politics is very often avoided. But also for those, there are some people here from Oil for Development. We should think of legitimate governance as a precondition for sector regulation to work. When I did a study of the political economy of the mining sector in Ghana, and they had checks and balances on paper. When the application for mining concessions was sent it was sent to the government, and then the envelope with these applications was sent to the parliamentary committee. The parliamentarians, they didn't even open the envelope because they had been instructed by the executive what to say. So they didn't even they didn't even look at the applications. So they had checks and balances on paper, but not in practice. And this tendency to avoid politics is really something that we have to deal with. We have to address politics and not act as if illegitimate governments we should not recognize them as much as we do. Another thing, we have to demand fair markets. One of the things that I have studied in my study research on corruption is the linkages between market power and corruption, and we cannot understand business corruption without understanding where the rents are coming from, and there have been much talk about the natural resource rents from natural resources, but in the utility sectors we see that market power is very often created to generate rents for the political elite, and in other markets as well. But it's very visible in the utilities and the construction sector as well. And for the companies, I get a bit upset. I've visited many conferences on corporate social responsibility, and they seem to think again and again that compliance is enough. They consider, what do we have to do to act within the law? But they should have to start demanding a market where they don't have to consider the question of corruption. They have to demand framework conditions that makes it obvious that the contracts are allocated fairly. And the last thing I want to say is that we have to make use of democracy, and that means that we have to make voters in the North understand how their tax burden is increasingly getting heavier, so that they have to realize they have to support initiatives for financial transparency. I think I stop it here.
I guess the audience are very eager to ask you some questions. I think the gentleman up here where...
Thank you. I'm Terry from South Africa. You opened your presentation with a map that showed the perceptions of Africa as highly corrupt. But these, of course, are perceptions from the north, where I would suggest that corruption is so institutionalized it's not even recognized as such. And particularly the British banking and armaments industry would be a case in point. So, for instance, in 1998, when I asked the British government to investigate whether BAE was bribing our politicians, it wasn't illegal in English law to bribe foreigners. And a few years later, the minister says, oh, bribes of £115 million were reasonable under the circumstances. Reasonable. But you referred also to the World Bank program to debar companies that bribe. And that comes out of Lesotho, if you will, from the Lesotho Highlands Water Scheme, which was funded by the World Bank, and where major international contractors were bribing local officials to cast a blind eye to local regulatory requirements. And they were outraged when Lesotho took on this issue. And the judge says, I don't care whether it's in English law, German law, Canadian law, whatever. The damage done was in Lesotho, of this tiny little country surrounded by South Africa. The damage done, and so the judge took jurisdiction. This is where the World Banks, and the World Bank initially was outraged by it, but thankfully it has made some amends, we would hope. But this is what we're facing, that so often it is a European company aligned with government that finds a local useful agent, the Mobutus, the Kabilas, the Mugabes, to be the front man, and then it's Africa that's left with the consequences. So I'm afraid we've got to also deal with Europe and the corruption that is so institutionalized in Europe before we can tackle that corruption in Africa.
A couple of very brief comments. First, on the Corruption Perception Index. It's an invention of the corporate community which wants to put the blame not on the bribe payer, but on the bribe recipient. And that was deliberate. And it was done when Transparency International was created. Now, good people have come into Transparency International, but they don't know how this got started. And the entire index is phony. And I'll go into that with anyone who wants to discuss it. Item 2, there is no substitute for prosecution. In World War II, in Denmark, the Nazis arrested all the Danish police. They didn't trust them. There was a crime wave in Denmark. Now, that should tell you no cops, no prosecution, crime. And it doesn't matter where on earth you're talking about it. Number 3, asset recovery. There's no substitute for going after the money. The World Bank could put a condition on its loans saying if this loan money is stolen, we'll recover it. I brought that up in multiple World Bank sessions. They say, we can't do that. That would be an interference with sovereignty. Excuse me, structural adjustment isn't? Why doesn't the World Bank act? The executive directors are the relatives of the people who are stealing the money. Think about that.
Yeah. To this gentleman here.
Robert Palmer from Global Witness. A lot of my work looks at the exactly what you're talking about, regulations on books but not implemented. And this is not in the poorest countries in the world, but in some of the richest countries in the world, where it comes to the money laundering regulations, which every country in the world almost has, but they're very badly implemented in almost every country, including the rich countries. So if rich countries can't get regulation and enforcement right, how can we expect developing countries to do the same?
Thank you very much for interesting comments. When it comes to, first, the indexes, I know the background of the Transparency International's index, but a very similar index is developed by the World Bank, and it doesn't have it is not made to protect industry, and it is not generated on the perceptions of Europeans. It is constructed on by it uses many different surveys, and it collects a lot of information. Most of the information, actually, from people in the countries. So it's not reflecting a European perception, and it's very difficult to prove that the levels are correct, but it is supported by many different, because I have been very critical of these indexes myself, and I wrote a paper, it's wrong to rank, and explained the weaknesses, but at the same time it seemed to reflect many of the variations across countries, but mostly on facilitation payments actually, and not really on political corruption. When it comes to the Lesotho case that you mentioned, I think one of the most depressing things about that case is that they hired a World Bank expert to oversee the case, and they considered this person with high integrity, and he got a very high wage in order so that he should not be tempted by corruption. And still, we got this case. So he actually took bribes, even. So it was a big disappointment also for that reason. When it comes to corruption in Europe, I totally agree, but as I mentioned in the beginning, that I would focus on the South in this presentation. And I have been working on development issues mostly, so that was also a natural thing to do. However, Transparency International Europe has recently conducted integrity studies all over Europe. Really careful studies. They have considered how well able are the European institutions all over Europe. They have studied carefully more than 300 institutions. How well able are we to prevent political corruption in Europe? And I have to say, the results were depressing. The risk of political corruption in Europe is high. That was the big conclusion coming out of it. And this survey, it doesn't just say that political corruption is a problem. It goes really into detail and explains why there is a significant risk of political corruption in European countries. So that's absolutely something I would support. And on asset recovery, the incentives to follow up on to actually go and conduct, to enforce the laws is not in place. They are not in place. So it's not only a lack of willingness, but there's nobody really got incentives to do the work. So that's something, and that's why I was mentioning this. Maybe this is something we should think differently about in development, in the development community.
So I think we should allow one more question, and then you could have the final word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hello. Yes, Godlisten from Tanzania, Christian Social Services Commission working. My interest is on corruption has been decorated with so many names and so many ways. And lawyers seems to compromise with corruptions. Why am I saying this? Taking case of Tanzania, the most of the investment contracts that have been signed is on the ground of the legal advice. And they have brought a dramatic problem in our country. What is your personal advice to the civil society organizations that they should take which step to solve or to make sure that this does not continue?
Thank you.
On this specific question, what is the advice to civil society organizations? Well, I think it's very important to attend conferences like this one, because financial issues have been seen as, they are very complex. So very often corruption has been, can take place without any risk of reactions from civil society because they don't understand the complexity of the issues. I think it's difficult myself. So I think knowledge and try to get access to information. And but my experience when I collaborate with researchers in developing countries is that, and also civil society, they are very worried to ask for information. In many countries, it's a very difficult thing. And myself, I have also asked for a lot of information that is supposed to be public, and we don't get it. It's not given to us. So we may well say that requesting information in all possible ways and knowledge to process it is extremely important for civil society organizations, and collaboration with journalists, of course. I want to just respond to one of the other questions. Okay. Is that okay? Because I was asked why the World Bank doesn't act. And I have to say that even if the World Bank, some parts of World Bank institutions may act as if they were commercial UN organizations, they really try to fight poverty but the World Bank is a big organization, and it can go only as far as its members allows. It is run by countries, and these countries steer the World Bank. When I was there, I thought I could try to influence things in the World Bank, but I realized that if I should influence the World Bank, I will have to influence my own government. So the World Bank is quite complex in that sense. So I'm sorry for overgeneralizing, and this presentation was not on one specific issue. It was a combination of many different issues, and I wanted to go systematically through these difficulties. But of course, many nuances were missing.
Thank you very much.